On the 19th of July, 1991, Jared Negrete, a 12-year-old boy from El Monte, California, traveled to Camp Tarquitz in the San Bernardino National Forest. He was going on an overnight camping trip with his Boy Scout troop, and they were planning to hike to the top of the 3,500-meter, 11,500 feet, Mount San Gorgonio. As the troop neared the top of the summit, Jared wandered away and disappeared after apparently straying onto the wrong trail. When the troop discovered that Jared was missing, an extensive search was conducted of the area by rescue teams. They found a lot of matching shoe prints, and some items which belonged to Jared, including his backpack, beef jerky, and candy wrappers. In spite of these clues, they could not find any trace of Jared. This story would probably be a straightforward and tragic case of a boy succumbing to the elements after getting lost in the wilderness, but Jared managed to leave behind one very haunting image. Jared's camera was also found in the woods, and its film contained 12 recent photographs which were eventually developed. Most of the pictures were landscape shots which were taken before he disappeared, but the last photo was a self-portrait which Jared had taken of himself. Since Jared's arms were too short to hold the camera out very far, the photo only wound up capturing his eyes and nose. It seemed clear that Jared looked scared and that the mysterious picture was taken after he went missing. This self-portrait of Jared Negrete remains the last existing trace of him. On the morning of the 11th of July, 1983, Maine State Police Detective Sergeant Ralph E. Pinkham got a call from a woman in Texas worried about her sister Jessie Albertine Hoover. She hadn't heard from her since the 16th of May, when Hoover called from a Bangor motel. At the time, her sister said, the 54-year-old had only about $15 to $20, but intended to wire for money when she passed through towns along the Appalachian Trail, which she had come to Maine to thru-hike. At Baxter State Park, Pinkham learned Hoover had talked with rangers about her hike plans and been turned away from summiting Mount Katahdin. She is believed to have started to hike south, but northbound Appalachian Trail hikers coming through the Daisy Pond checkpoint hadn't seen her at all. In fact, it had been 6 weeks since anyone had into the woods. When Hoover had stepped off a bus in Bangor in early May, she was bound for an adventure of a lifetime, hiking the Appalachian Trail. Yet she was neither an experienced hiker nor familiar with the North Woods, outside of an inspiring article in National Geographic. Jessie Hoover? Jessie Hoover? Courtesy of Mary Yaden. An investigation eventually mounted by the Maine Warden Service traced her to the trailhead of the 100-mile wilderness, south of Baxter State Park. It's the most remote stretch of the entire Appalachian Trail, surrounded by about 15 million acres of lonely forest. It's not a place to take lightly, says retired game warden Dave Sewell, who led the investigation into her disappearance. If you want to do it prepared. By all accounts, the 5-foot 10-inch, 240-pound Hoover was dangerously unprepared. When she walked into the Maine wilderness, she was wearing blue jeans, a blue shirt, a blue windbreaker, and heavy shoes, carrying a blue knapsack for the 2,180-mile hike to Springer Mountain in Georgia. She also was suffering from epilepsy, according to her family, and took regular medication. Since her disappearance, Hoover's name has been little more than a footnote in Maine history. Her name was forgotten for decades, and only listed recently in public missing person reports and unsolved case files. Yet her family in White Settlement, Texas, still waits for an answer to a question first asked 32 years ago: what happened to Jessie Hoover? Did she really simply disappear without a trace? On Friday, the 12th of August 2011, a group of hikers came across a dead body, apparently murdered and lying in a shallow grave along a side trail to Cow Camp Gap Shelter in George Washington Jefferson National Forest. The area is in the Mount Pleasant Special Management Area. The body was identified as Appalachian Trail AT hiker Scott Hurley, 30, of South Bend, Indiana. Scott was likely dead around 12 days before his discovery. One theory was that Scott had been attacked by hill people hillbillies, but Cow Camp Gap is not isolated and is a highly used recreational area. It is miles to the nearest human habitation, and one common characteristic of hillbillies is that they are not big walkers. The only time you'll see them in remote areas is if they are accessible by ATV, which Cow Camp Gap isn't. It's also an extremely popular loop trail for day hikes and overnight camping. It is not the sort of place anyone would set up a pot farm. In January 2012, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner would release the cause of death of Scott Lilly as asphyxia by suffocation, and ruled the death a homicide. Lilly's blue or purple backpack, new trail shoes, Walmart's Ozark Trail brand, a Nintendo game, and an AT handbook were taken by whoever killed him. Although it was never stated by investigators whether they believed that robbery was the motive for the attack. On the 15th of November 2001, Louise Charput, 52, drove from Sherbrooke, Quebec, to Pinkham's Grant, where she had reserved a room at the Joe Dodge Lodge at the Appalachian Mountain Club Visitor Center for a long weekend in the mountains. Charput loved the outdoors and hiking and was particularly fond of the Mount Washington Valley. I tell her, be safe, and don't make things dangerous, and she tell me, no, don't be afraid. I will be okay. And if I'm not coming back Monday, you can call the police, but that was a joke, her daughter, Corinne, told said. With daylight fading when she arrived at 3 p.m., Charput asked an AMC worker at the Pinkham Notch Visitor Center for directions to a short hike that would get her back before dusk. The clerk suggested a short walk around Lost Pond Trail, which began just across the street from the lodge. Charput was never seen alive again. When she failed to return home the following Monday, friends and family called police to report her missing. Authorities found Charput's car parked at the Diatissima Trailhead, across the street from the Lost Pond Trailhead. Police said they believe someone stole the keys to the car, but not the car itself. They said the larger of two backpacks Charput had with her was gone, but her hiking shoes, along with her water and chocolate, two things she always took hiking with her, was still in the car. Her body was found with multiple stab wounds on Thanksgiving Day, a short distance off the Glen Boulder Trail. I was thinking it was like a bad dream, or something like that, because for me, it was not reality, her daughter said. Police said in 2004 that Charput was hiking on the Glen Boulder Trail, but that whoever killed her forced her off that trail and brought her down into a clearing about 100 yards away. Her death was ruled was a homicide. Officials said all evidence indicates that the attack was random and that the killer was likely someone from the area whom Charput didn't know. While investigators said 10 years after Charput's death that the case had direction, they have never been able to identify her killer. The murder of Rebecca White, the 17th of October, 1959, the 13th of May, 1988, occurred on the 13th of May, 1988, in Pennsylvania's Michos State Forest, when Stephen Roy Carr fired on White and her partner, Claudia Brenner. Rebecca White was a student of Iranian Puerto Rican heritage, who was working on her master's degree in business administration, and Claudia Brenner was a Jewish, Manhattan-born architecture student. They had been partners for 2 years after having met over breakfast, while both were students at Virginia Tech. In May 1988, White and Brenner were hiking the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania. They parked their car at Dead Woman Hollow and hiked into Michos State Forest, where they set up camp. The murder. White first encountered Stephen Roy Carr in a public restroom near their campground. Carr, 22, sometimes lived in a cave and carried a .22 caliber rifle. He asked White for a cigarette. She said she didn't have one, and hurried back to the campsite, where she told Brenner that someone else was there. The couple dressed and decided to find a more private campsite. The couple encountered Carr again later that day, when they stopped to look at their map. Brenner and White eventually set up camp in a new location. They ate dinner, and began to have sex. Unseen by the couple, Carr watched them from 82 feet away. He fired 8 bullets at the women. Brenner was hit 5 times in the arm, face, head, and neck. White was shot twice in the head and back. The last shot shattered White's liver. The 8th bullet missed. White was unable to stand, so Brenner hiked 4 miles to the road, where she was able to get a ride to the Shippensburg police station. 9:10, at the station, Brenner gave the police all the details of their ordeal except one: she did not tell police that they were lesbians. When the police returned to the scene, they found that White had died from her wounds. Brenner received word of White's death while in the hospital. Carr thought both women were dead. He left 25 rounds of ammunition at the scene, along with a knit cap he'd worn. Police found them at the scene. For 10 days after the shooting, Carr hid in a Mennonite community. Since members of the community did not read the news or watch television, they did not know Carr was a suspect in a shooting until one member, who had secretly watched television, recognized Carr from the composite drawing on the news, and called police. Police arrested Carr on a warrant from Florida for grand larceny. Carr waived his right to a jury trial in exchange for an agreement by the prosecution not to seek the death penalty. At trial, Carr claimed he had been enraged by the sight of the 2 women having sex, that the 2 women had taunted him by having sex in front of him. His public defender said he'd been raped in a Florida prison and sexually abused as a child. The attorney claimed that the couple's lesbianism was provocation that caused his client inexplicable rage. The judge refused to allow evidence of Carr's psychosexual history, ruling it irrelevant. He also disallowed the introduction of Brenner's and White's relationship in court, thus forcing the defense to cut a deal and accept a sentence of life without parole. On the 8th of March, 1991, Carr's appeal, based on the court's decision to disallow introduction of his psychosexual history in court, was denied by the Superior Court of Pennsylvania.